watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
Hello, I'm Mark Golub, and here we are in the midst of the Jewish high holiday season, a season when, perhaps more than any other, Jews find their way to the synagogue. There are wonderful themes that represent the high holidays, and very often people who come to the synagogue are hoping to hear from their rabbi or rabbis words of inspiration, words of meaning, words that will resonate the entire year. I have an extraordinary opportunity and a pleasure to present to you two wonderful pulpit rabbis who will be speaking to their respective congregations during the high holidays, and have asked them simply to join me to talk about what's on their mind, what they hope they'll be able to communicate to their congregants during the high holidays. And I hope that as you listen to them, whether you will be attending a service during the holidays or not, the words that you'll hear from these two gentlemen will in some way touch you, move you, and enable you to more fully participate in the sense of the Jewish high holidays. It is my great pleasure to represent to you and to present to you on my left, Rabbi Mitchell Wohlberg, who is the rabbi of the Beth Tfilah Synagogue in Baltimore, Maryland, and he's the author of Pulpit Power, published by Emek Publishing and available through Beth Tfilah. And on my right, Rabbi Andrew Warmflash, who's the rabbi of the Hewlett East Rockaway Jewish Center on Long Island, New York. And he also serves on the Board of Trustees of the Schechter Institute Rabbinical School in Jerusalem. And Mitchell and Andy, thank you so much for joining me and for being willing just to share some of your feelings and ideas as the two of you now prepare for your own high holiday congregation services. Incidentally, Mitchell, as the high holidays approach, at what point do you begin to feel the pressure of having to say something that is going to be meaningful to, and again, you have how many families in your congregation?
We have 1,400 families.
1,400 families. And in general, this is true for every rabbi, most of the largest congregation comes on the holidays.
That's correct.
So how many people will be attending your services?
Well, in our main sanctuary, we'll have about 1,700 people, and we have 2 overflow services. So altogether, there'll be about 2,700 people in the synagogue.
And how often will you speak? How often will you actually give a sermon?
I will deliver the same Rosh Hashanah sermon in 2 of the services, the Kol Nidre sermon in 2 of the services, and the Yom Kippur sermon in 2 of the services.
Okay, so you're preparing at least 3 major addresses to your congregation.
That is correct.
Okay, at what point do you begin to feel the pressure and begin to be thinking about what you want to say and what you hope to convey?
I start to feel the pressure as soon as I complete my Yom Kippur sermon.
That's so, Andy, isn't that honest?
I was going to say Simchas Torah.
Go ahead.
My Yom Kippur sermon is usually a sermon that runs for close to an hour, which for a rabbi is really stretching his luck. And when I sit down afterwards, my first thought is, what am I going to do next year? So you start thinking, but the pressure really comes for me in the summer. I usually sit down and do most of the work, giving some thought to what are the major issues. And surprisingly, as much as I want to be relevant, it doesn't change that much from the summer to the fall. The themes are the themes.
Mm-hmm. Andy, what do you find?
Well, I also, right after the first high holidays, begins to think about the second. But the pressure certainly starts to build. And the month of Elul in particular, when I'm starting to polish my sermons and to think about them, I watch the moon in the sky, and as it starts to get fuller, I start to really focus. I remember, I can't help it, I'm sure you had the same experience, thinking back to September 11th, and to the destruction of the towers. And it was a moment of great tragedy, but it was a moment of panic for rabbis. Because here we had worked and planned and prepared, and then much of what we had done had to be put aside.
Yes,
because it was a completely different reality.
In 2001, the Jewish high holidays were virtually at that moment.
It was a matter of a week or so.
Yes. I also want to know from you, Well, how many members of your congregation?
We have 650 families.
Okay. And Andy, you're the rabbi in a conservative synagogue.
That's correct.
I should have said that. And Mitchell, you're in an Orthodox synagogue. Okay. So, and roughly, Andy, how many people are going to be in your service on the high holidays?
About 2,000.
About 2,000. Okay. So both of you are speaking to enormous numbers of people. So, in general, not necessarily Mitchell in terms of this particular year, but in general, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to evoke in the people who are listening to you? And I'll say one more thing, and you'll tell me if the two of you agree with me. We who have the opportunity, the privilege to address people on the high holidays, most rabbis take that very seriously. It's an honor, it's a privilege, and the rabbi feels that this is an opportunity to say something important, and that it's to the covet of the congregation's honor, that we say something meaningful, that none of us want people to leave and say, well, what was that about? We want people to go out of the room saying, that was worth my time, and somehow it's going to make a difference. In general, what are the themes you are looking at? What's the orientation, Mitchell, you bring to your speaking to people on the high holidays?
Generally speaking, I divide the three major sermons that I'm going to deliver into three distinct subjects. The first sermon generally speaks about the condition of the American Jew from both a political, economic, spiritual, religious perspective. The second sermon invariably focuses on Israel, because I do feel that the state of Israel is central to Jewish existence today. And the third, this sermon that I deliver on Yizkor, is usually one of a personal nature, speaking of family relationships and the need to hold the family together. Mm-hmm. So those are the three themes that invariably every year I keep going back to, but obviously there's different ways of looking at them from year to year. Last year my mother passed away, and so my Yizkor sermon had to do not just with my mother, but with every mother. And I always try and find the theme that I believe relates to everybody in the synagogue. And everybody in the synagogue has a mother.
So what did you say about your mother and mothers?
Well, in my particular instance, I spoke about the difficulty of mothers having to let go, and how we as children deal with that, and how this letting go is a part of our life experience in so many different ways. Letting go of our youth, letting go of our children, and ultimately having to let go of life itself. My mother was 95 years old when she passed away, and her last words were, "Get me some ice cream." That's the way to go. Mm-hmm. When things are good, don't sweat the small stuff. Mm. There's so many things that can aggravate us, but don't let it get to you, because aggravation is inevitably going to come in life from the big stuff. Don't waste it on the small stuff. That would be a beginning perspective for me.
That's beautiful, that's beautiful. Andy, what do you try to do on the high holidays?
Well, you know, to pick up on something that Mitchell just said, I think for me the main theme of the holidays is a confrontation with our mortality. It's another year. A year has passed. We're a year older. And we know, and the liturgy reminds us again and again, that life is short, like a passing shadow, you know. And so the question is, how do we make best use of the time that God grants us? Mm-hmm. And what I hope to do in a variety of ways is to get people to focus on that, on the urgency of life and on the urgency of living a life of meaning.
What's the mistake we make in terms of the lack of appreciation here?
Well, I think we are largely asleep. You know, Maimonides, in talking about the shofar, talks about it being an alarm clock, a kind of spiritual alarm clock that wakes us up. The truth is that we often lead our lives in a somewhat unconscious way, and the holidays are meant to wake us up so that we appreciate what we have and we don't squander it.
Everything you say resonates so strongly with me, and for me too. I happen to think that the holidays are an intensely personal time, and I'm trying to find the themes which I believe those who are listening have to grapple with in their own personal lives. What does it mean to be a mensch in this world? What does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be a child? What does it mean to have parents who are older, who now need to be cared for? I also have found, and I'll digress for a moment and ask you to comment, I have found that there is no such thing as the ideal, perfect television family, and that every family struggles in some way with, and I'll use a strong word now, estrangement. I'm always surprised and saddened by the extent to which, for various reasons, and I want you to comment now, for various reasons, family members who really love each other end up estranged or in some kind of conflict. Have you found that to be true?
Every family has its dysfunctional aspects to it, and how we deal with that is what makes or breaks the family. The Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah speaks about the ultimate dysfunctional family. Abraham and Sarah, they had to go and move to another country, and she couldn't become pregnant, and he took in another woman, and they had children who didn't get along, and he tried to kill his child, and Sarah didn't know about it. Talk about dysfunctional. This is our patriarch and our matriarch, and we can learn from them. They made it, we can make it as well. But it requires a lot of hard work, a lot of effort, and it involves being prepared to say, I don't know it all, I don't have it all, but I'm prepared to look for it.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. You know, those narratives, the patriarchal narratives that we encounter on the holidays, and also in the Haftarahs, the story of Hannah and how she wants a child, and how she's misunderstood in that process. And the sense of loss that pervades it all. Even when you get what you want, there's a price that you pay. The holidays lurch us into that world, and there's so much resonance in our own lives.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that there are families in your congregations where there is disharmony between adult children and their adult parents?
Oh, never.
We're talking about Jewish families.
I'm struck by the fact that this mitzvah to honor your parents, which we often sort of water down as being that young children should somehow obey their parents. And the rabbis tell us the hardest mitzvah of all, because we struggle, I think all of us struggle, with respecting our parents and honoring our parents and caring for our parents, and yet being very different from our parents.
So what advice would you give people?
Well, the main thing is to listen. We just don't listen enough, not only to people's words, but to what's behind the words. Because if you hear them and they feel heard, then often there's a place you can come to which, look, there are feelings we have that are very deep sometimes, and hurts that we have that are very deep. But particularly in families, we're bound together in such a profound way that if we listen to each other with honor and with respect, we can usually find a way to bridge these gaps.
I think the important word here is honor. We're told to honor our parents. We're not being told to love our parents, told to love God. Not all of our parents are lovable. That's a reality. There are parents who are abusive. There are parents who are alcoholic. There are families where husband and wife have a total lack of communication. And obviously children growing up in such a home are going to have their own feelings, their negative feelings about the relationship that they were put into. Our responsibility is to honor our parents because they are the only parents we are going to ever have. And they gave us the opportunity to live in this world. They are worthy of our honor, even if they're not lovable.
Mm-hmm. It is a Jewish insight that it's not supposed to be an equal relationship, parent to child. And that I have a sense that what we as parents and even grandparents have to understand is, first of all, there's an absolute necessity to remember what we felt like when we were kids and not ask our children to do more for us than we were willing to do for our own parents. And many of us grew up and had lives of our own and went our own way, and our parents were important to us, but we were living our own lives. And yet when we become parents, lo and behold, there's a sense of, where are you? And why aren't you calling? And why don't we see you more? And one of the things I think is important for parents to remember is that what we want our young people to do as they grow up and get married and create a family of their own is to be independent, still care about us, but the focus of their lives now becomes their own families. Would you agree?
I would agree, but I think it's a child's responsibility to understand that what their parents are going through is both natural and very difficult.
It's hard, though, because they haven't been there yet.
It's hard and it's heartbreaking. On the one hand, the parent has to let go. On the other hand, now for the first time, it is not the child who needs the parent, it is the parent who needs the child. A parent at a certain point in life realize that you can get your stock certificates cashed in, but they don't wish you a happy birthday. And you can get all your dividends mailed to you, but nobody is coming and giving you a hug.
That's right.
And for that personal touch, they need you. That, to me, is part of the responsibility to respect your parents' needs, even though you cannot possibly fill all of them while still being your own self.
Yes, and my only problem with it is that it's very hard for a young person, a child, to understand what the parent is feeling. It's easier if a parent remembers what it was like to be a child, but a child hasn't yet been the 40 and 50 and 60 and 7-year-old parent, you know?
Yeah, I think that's true. I saw that in my own life recently. A year ago, I had my first grandchild.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. And then I saw my son being a parent.
Yes.
And I saw some of the sleepless nights, and I saw him struggling with the responsibility for this new life. And on the one hand, I felt enormous empathy for him. And on the other hand, I felt, now he knows. Now he knows what it is to be a parent. And I think as we grow older, we gain a certain perspective on life. Hopefully, we don't have to gain it the hard way, but we gain a certain perspective on life.
We grow up with the feeling that our parents don't understand us.
Yes.
When we've really grown up is when we realized we didn't fully understand our parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what we hope for is that the generations, the parents and the children, in both directions, can be more understanding of the other.
We have to learn to build that into our things to do lists.
Mm-hmm. What I beg people to do in some way on the holidays is to find a way to forgive each other and to reconcile, and that, as you said before, the family togetherness is the most precious thing we have. First there's health, and then there's family. And I feel so bad for people and for families where there is alienation between children and parents, or brothers and sisters, or an uncle is excluded. And I feel one of the things the holidays does is it comes once a year to remind us that forgiveness is really an obligation, and that by letting go of any of these hurts, and pride is such a horrible, horrible thing in terms of how it gets in the way of what we're willing to do with other people. Just let it go and embrace each other, and somehow the year will be sweeter and richer.
One additional aspect to that is, don't forgive that person for their sake. Forgive that person for your sake. You're carrying the burden of anger and distrust and making this much more than it is for that person. Forgive for your sake, and you'll feel a tremendous weight has been removed from your shoulders.
It's interesting. I asked you both to begin with, where do you begin as you begin to look at the high holidays? I want to point out what you didn't say, and I want you to tell me why. Neither one of you talked about sin. Neither one of you talked about Aveira or Chet. And in general, when you ask people who are somewhat distant from the high holidays. What's the holidays about? The immediate answer is it's teshuvah, repentance for all the sins we've committed in the year gone by, and to somehow commit ourselves to a better year. But lo and behold, we have not mentioned Aveira or Chet or sin, and that's not where the two of you, each of you, neither of you began there. Mitchell, why?
Because a generation of rabbis did that and turned off a generation of Jews. Because people would come to the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah and the rabbi would get up and condemn them for only coming on the high holidays. So then they showed him, and then they started not coming even then. And I personally don't believe that giving lashes to people for their flaws is the way of bringing them closer to their religious tradition. We can speak about the mistakes they are making. We can speak about the need for a change in the route they are taking. But I don't think that we need belabor the point of sin and damnation. First of all, I don't think it's really truly a Jewish perspective. And secondly, I just don't think it works.
Yeah, I also think that, and maybe I'm naive, I don't look at a congregation of sinners. I look at good people who are struggling to lead good lives, and sometimes we falter, but this is not, we are not, you know, the image of the scales being slightly out of balance is the right one for me. We're not talking about serious sin. We're talking about missed opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I also think that there's a danger in speaking too much about sin. I was talking to a woman before the holidays, last year I think it was, and I said to her, you know, you seem down. And she said, yes, the holidays are coming, and you know, and I know I've got so many imperfections. And I said to her, the liturgy is not for people like you. Right? It's for the people who think they're perfect. They need to be reminded that they're human. Right?
Yes.
We're all God's children. We're all in God's image. And most of us, look, there's evil in the world, and there are bad people, and there is such a thing as sin. But most of the people who come to synagogue are not sinful. They're just looking to lead better lives.
You know, mine is an Orthodox synagogue, and there is always an issue in terms of people driving to the synagogue as opposed to walking to the synagogue. And, you know, there's always some religious Cossack who will point out to me that so-and-so drove. And
a religious Cossack.
Yeah.
I love that phrase.
No, I think
yes.
that's an appropriate description. It said, so-and-so drove to the synagogue, he shouldn't be given an honor. I say, no, so-and-so didn't drive to the synagogue. So-and-so walked to the synagogue. As he got from his car, he walked to the synagogue. I think it's very important to look at people accordingly. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't believe in sin. On Yom Kippur, 5 times we beat our breasts and say, for the sin that we have committed, for the sin that we committed. I think that is there to make everybody look into a mirror. And we didn't do all of those sins. I mean, nobody has done them all, but there's always something there that sticks out, that speaks to us. But I think our responsibility as rabbis has changed. I mean, we have 2 models of religious leaders in the Jewish tradition. There was Moses and Aaron. Moses was the man who, he was the prophet. And he saw things in their ideal way, and he smashed the tablets and condemned the people and referred to them as being rebels. Aaron was the priest, and the priest has to console the people and comfort the people and bring them closer together. And I think that our generation is more a generation of Aaron's than a generation of Moses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's true, which is not to say that we don't want to challenge our congregations. We're not panderers. We're not up there simply to tell them that they're terrific and perfect and life is great. But we want to challenge them to be the people we know they can be, not to dismiss them or to make them feel so. You know, when a person really feels bad about themselves, it's very hard for them to aspire to anything. And it may be true in some extreme cases that you have to hit bottom before you can turn up. But in fact, I think for most people, glimpsing the possibility of leading a better, more meaningful, more spiritual life, being reminded that they can in fact aspire to that is all they need. They don't need to be chastised.
Let me tell you what we want to accomplish on the high holidays. It's all summed up in one word that you don't hear of on the American scene. The word is change. Nobody on the American scene is talking about change these days. And change is the theme of the high holidays any year in any sermon.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Andy, what insight is there in the fact that virtually every confessional, the Al-Chet on Yom Kippur, is in the first person plural? We say, we have sinned. We don't normally say, I have sinned. What's the insight there?
Well, I think we come to synagogue on the high holidays in part to be part of a community, right? And to the extent that we are changing and redirecting ourselves, we have a sense of responsibility to one another as a community. That whatever one other member of that community, whether it's my local community or the broad Jewish community does, has implications for me, and what I do has implications for them. And so we're all in it together. As a Jewish people, we're all in it together.
Many people think that rabbis view themselves as clerics do in other religious traditions. Rabbis don't tend to look at themselves as holier than thou unless they've failed to understand what being a rabbi is. To what extent have you been able to understand that if there are people who are struggling to be better people in your congregation, it's no different than what you're trying to do?
I think that's part of my success in the rabbinate.
I do too.
The very fact that I'm sharing my life experiences with people to let them know that I am going through the same issues and the same challenges that they are going through. That I, as a grandfather, as a husband, as a rabbi, as a human being, I'm having my conflicts not only with other human beings, I'm having my conflicts with God.
Do you share your doubt?
Oh, absolutely. This year, my Yom Kippur sermon is on the subject of cancer. Now, I don't have to tell you how difficult a subject that is to discuss, but I told you I look for a subject that I think speaks to an entire congregation.
That's very courageous of you, Mitchell.
And God
It's very
Almighty, does cancer speak to an entire congregation?
Absolutely.
And when it happens, is this God getting at you? And my own questions and my own doubts, I have to go visit in children's oncology. If there were ever two words that should never have to be said in the same sentence, it's children's oncology. And then I'm going back to the synagogue and I'm speaking of God as being compassionate and merciful.
And how do you reconcile?
For that, you have to come to my synagogue and hear the
because
sermon.
we can't be there. I'd love to be there. I'm going to be leading my own service, or I'd be there, Mitchell. How do you reconcile the theodicy issue, no matter how you describe it? You've picked, I think, a quintessential example. How do you in some way synthesize the suffering of the innocent child and a good, all-powerful God? Mitchell, Wohlberg, how do you deal with that?
Mark, first of all, I'm shocked to hear that others have confronted the same question. I wasn't aware of that. The only people who have confronted that question are people like Abraham and Moses and Job and Voltaire, and in the 20th century, everybody who has had to deal with the Holocaust. Now, there are many different approaches to it. Fortunately, I would have to say we don't know which is right and which is wrong. There are some religious thinkers like the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, who sees the hand of God in every single thing that happens in this world, literally including every leaf that falls. And so obviously somebody coming from that perspective sees God involved in people who are having cancer or having difficulties and might see this as punishment from God. I have to respect that opinion. I just can't accept it. There are others who say that the suffering brings us closer to God. I have to respect that opinion, but keep me far away from such a God. I believe that there are things in this world that are a matter of nature and a matter of fate. And the Talmud speaks of it in many different ways. If I pick up a piece of wheat and it's stolen wheat and I replant it, it shouldn't grow. It's stolen wheat. But nature follows its own course. I think this is true of the human being as well, and I think this is true in terms of cancer. When somebody gets sick and they go to the doctor never asks them if they've been moral, if they've been ethical. The doctor asks them for a family history. Because if their parents had diabetes, there's a good chance that they will. That's not fair. That's not moral. That's nature. We're living in a world of natural law. I do also believe that there is another world which is ruled by supernatural law, where all of the injustices in this world are made good.
By the way, it is the most difficult question for a rabbi to answer, but I want to hear your answer too. How do you try to help a family where there has seemed to be, again, a degree of pain and suffering that seems to have no rationale? And again, Mitchell uses the child with cancer, but there are all kinds of examples of human tragedy. Is this God's fault, Andy?
Of course not.
Of course not.
You're trying to ruin our business?
No. Look, God created the world in a certain way for God's own reasons. And some of the consequences of that design cause enormous pain to people. But to say that God is the author of that pain, or that God desires or intends that pain, describes a God that I personally can't believe in. I think one of the most misunderstood prayers in the High Holiday Liturgy, and it's probably the best known, is Unatana Tokef. Mm-hmm. And it's a prayer that tells us that on Rosh Hashanah it's written, in Yom Kippur it is sealed who will live and who will die. And then it goes on to tell us that tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah, that repentance and prayer and acts of righteousness, that this can annul the severity of the decree. And most people who don't think about that prayer say, you see, your fate is going to be determined by whether you pray and by whether you give tzedakah, and that idea that somehow there's a magic to religion and that magic will help us to avoid the catastrophes that life brings us. I don't think that's what that prayer is saying, and I think it's a fundamentally mistaken idea.
So what is the prayer saying?
I think the prayer is a strategy for coping when those things happen. It doesn't say it annuls the decree. It doesn't say tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah will cancel what will happen to us.
I thought it says it averts the severe decree.
It
averts, by the way, it does cancel.
Well,
and it seems to me, by the way, that prayer, I think you're so right, A, to choose it, and B, I believe you're right, it's the most misunderstood. Because for me, when I read the paragraph, and instantly, a brief story, when I was a child, going with my grandfather to shul, the Orthodox shul. I don't know if you guys know that on 79th Street there's the famous Karlbach shul, and my grandfather would take me on Yom Kippur. And I remember one day he handed me the book. He said, you've got to know what you're saying. Read the English. And the English I happened to pick is the Unatana Tokef. Who will die by fire, who will die by sword, who will die by strangulation, and it lists a very horrific description of not only who will die and who will live, but how you're going to die and who will wax rich and who will be poor. And then there's the punchline. And I, as a child, never read the punchline. And the punchline is, in your life, how you live is what matters. And that, yes, tzedakah, acts of loving kindness, and tefillah, and in some way being as lovely as a human being as you possibly can be, averts the severe decree.
I have to take issue with you, right? Ma'avirin et roa hagezera, not ma'avirin et hagezera. It averts the evil of the decree. In other words,
Fine.
Look,
It averts the evil
No.
of the decree.
the decree is the decree. What's going to happen to us in life, whether we get cancer or whether there's an earthquake or a flood.
But you're not suggesting that people die or live by whether they are they give tzedakah.
No, I'm suggesting.
There's no decree like that, is there, Andy? Wait a minute, Andy, I want to make sure we
No,
understand.
I'm
Is
certainly-
there any decree that God, that a real God does wherever God is, that on Rosh Hashanah, whether you will live or die is determined?
Not at all.
Okay. And so it's not about that kind of decree. But wait, do we agree that the Unitarian Culture is poetry and not a scientific description of the world? Would each of you
Wait.
give me that?
I'll give you that, but I still want to make a point.
Okay,
because
it is poetry, though.
Yes.
Is it poetry?
Nothing in the Siddur is scientific.
Okay, so there's a poetic statement here. And the poetic statement is, a decree is made. But the interesting thing is not about the decree. The interesting thing is about the punchline. And the punchline is that these things avert the severe decree.
Look, there's a difference between pain and suffering. Right? Pain is something that comes to us. Suffering is how we experience it. And I think that part of what our tradition is trying to do is to give us tools to deal, when we have pain, to deal with the suffering that comes. And I think that tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah, that repentance and prayer and acts of kindness, these are things, they don't cancel the decree. They don't change what's going to happen.
What do you mean they don't cancel the
change,
decree?
They change how we
No, I want you to, when you say they don't cancel the decree, is there a decree that's not canceled?
They don't alter our fate. They alter our experience of our fate.
What is fate?
Look,
You believe in fate, Andy?
no, I believe in science, and I believe that people, I don't mean a fate in the sense that God has a list, and he says, this one was good and this one was bad. What I believe in, which is very similar to what Mitchell said, is that there are things in the world that happen to people, that there are diseases and there are earthquakes and there are floods. And the fact that we will experience them is often a matter of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or it's a matter of having the wrong genes.
Or genes, exactly right.
Well, that's fate.
And-
Mark,
Yes, but the reason why I rankle at the word fate is, fate suggests some divine plan. And as Andy said, it's not about fate that God says, you know what, I'm going to make sure that certain genes go into Mitchell and that he's going to get cancer at a certain age. I don't think any of the three of us believe in that kind of God. What you're saying is, and I think, again, you quote, in my mind, one of the most important Talmudic principles that is very often missed, that the world is set up with a natural order and the world follows its natural order. And what's more important is that God plays by those rules. In the Jewish tradition, God never suspends or interferes with the natural order.
If he does, we call that a miracle.
And to my understanding, when you read Midrash, there is no scientific miracle ever in the Jewish tradition. God never makes a miracle by suspending nature. That the miracle that the Jewish tradition understands is when things happen and people see it and recognize it. But God does not, in a literal sense, ever suspend the laws of nature, because that is against what God wants of the world and us. And when you talk about how the entire Siddur and Machzor, the entire prayer book and the High Holiday prayer book is poetry, I think you have hit on something which many Jews do not understand. And I think we as rabbis have a responsibility to explain to the people we have a chance to speak to, is that the Jewish tradition is this extraordinary worldview expressed in poetic terms in an effort to touch the soul of each one of us. And when you mention that, and I wish you'd talk about that more for a moment, I think that's an insight that people must understand. The Jewish tradition is never meant as a literal science book.
There's no question about that. I think the literalism gets caught up in fundamentalism.
Yes.
I can believe that the Torah, and I do believe every word is the word of God. That does not mean that every word has to be interpreted literally. I don't interpret every word literally, neither did Rashi, neither did Ramban, and certainly not Maimonides. And I think that's a severe problem that we confront in the world today when we are dealing with a world of religious extremism, which very frequently is based on a literal reading of an ancient text and not being able to hear it and see it in a modern context. And I think that's the major responsibility that each of us as religious leaders have, is to take that ancient text, not throw it away, no, make it come alive. And I think that we can do that. And when we do that, I think people are inspired and are uplifted and, yes, can change.
Yeah, you know, anyone who reads the Torah with an open mind cannot view it the way a fundamentalist does. If you look at Genesis chapter 1, and it describes the creation of people, and you look at the description in chapter 2, they don't really jibe, 1 and 2. According to chapter 1, the animals are created before mankind. In chapter 2, a man is created, then the animals, then women. The book was never meant to be viewed as some scientific account of creation. Right? It's meant to teach us about our relationship to God and our relationship to other people. It has profound truths which, at least from my perspective, are in some ways much more important than what science has to teach you. There's a famous picture, it was on the internet a lot, after Katrina, of someone who waded through a flood to save a Torah scroll, right? No one would do that for a science book. Right? This is God's most precious gift to us, and to reduce it to some account of, well, this came first and this came second, I think is to dismiss the power of this gift and the importance of it and the beauty of this gift.
I want to pick up on something you said earlier. I asked you, do you ever share your doubt? And you said yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for some Jews, they want their rabbis never to doubt the existence of God, the power of God, God in any way.
I have a great answer.
Tell me.
That's why there's a synagogue down the street for those Jews. I have an answer to that.
Please.
Noach. Rashi describes him as being mikatane emuna, of having little faith. He believed and he didn't believe. When God said there'll be a flood, he took his time. He wasn't so sure that he's going to, when it was up to his neck, that's when he started really getting into the ark. And the Bible tells us, Ves Elokim hisalech Noach. God and Noah walked together. I'm no worse than that. Mm-hmm. Let it be said the same of me someday.
Andy, do you ever doubt?
Of course I do. I didn't grow up in a religious home. And there have been moments in my life when I felt God's presence. But the truth is that those moments have been few and fleeting. Those are the moments you live for, and they're moments you cherish, and you try to remember, and you try to hold on to. And then there are other moments when God seems very distant. And sure, you have doubts. Certainly I have doubts. It's the nature of people to have doubts in an absolute.
My doubt isn't in the existence of God.
Really?
No, I don't have any doubt about the existence of God. I don't believe this world could have happened by chance. I just don't believe that. And those who do believe that it happened by chance, Crick and other scientists, they have to come up with ways of explaining that. You know, one of the scientific approaches is that billions of years ago, a spaceship came from another planet, which started things here. You want to believe in that? Fine. I find it much easier to believe in God. And every time I visit somebody in a hospital who gave birth and I hold that baby, this did not happen by chance. You never have to ask me to define the divine image. It's right there in every face.
My own sense is that although I respect the way you describe why you are convinced that there's a God in this universe, I have enormous compassion for, and I believe there's even Jewish legitimacy for, the person who says, as you do, Andy, there are moments when I'm sure, and a lot of times I'm not sure. And the technical word for that now is agnostic. There's a huge difference in my mind between an atheist who's sure there's no God. Somebody's sure there's no God.
There's a verse that speaks of this in the prophets where it says, Osi Azvu Ves Torasi Tishmaru, that you've left me, but you're following my commandments. And the rabbis add to that the word halavai. It should only be that
That's
way.
correct. God
Better
says it halavai. Right?
Yeah, better that you don't believe in me, but be a mensch.
Exactly
and do
right.
the right thing.
And that's the ultimate Jewish message, isn't it?
I'm not going to tell you it's the ultimate Jewish message.
The ultimate Jewish message is be a mensch.
The ultimate Jewish message is be a mensch, but I'm not going to say at the expense of believing in God.
No, that's correct.
The ultimate Jewish message is you should love your neighbor as yourself,
Correct.
and you should love the Lord your God with all your
No, that's not true.
No.
No, we disagree now. The two greatest rabbis of all time, Akiva and Hillel, both were asked the question. And Akiva answers, the most important line of the Torah is, you should love your neighbor as yourself.
As yourself.
He doesn't speak about loving God. And Hillel's asked the same question. And Hillel says, what is hurtful to you, don't do to your neighbor. Neither one mentions God. And incidentally, I'm not suggesting in any way that the Jewish tradition does not have a devotion for but you know better than I that the Hebrew doesn't say believe in, it's really trust in. We trust that there's a God more than believe in a God. And I understand that's the Jewish tradition. But ultimately, the bottom line is, the midrash you chose a moment ago, that God says, if I had to choose, I want you to be a lovely person. And if you somehow what I want of you is to be as lovely and as kind and as gentle as you can possibly be. And the key word for me in the rabbinic literature is ki'ilu. You will act as if you believe in God, even if you don't. That's the Jewish message. The Jewish message is it's all about how you behave. And if belief comes in there too, that's nice.
Yes, it is all about how you behave. But how you behave is affected by your belief in God, because there are many different patterns of behavior, and without a God-mandated commandment, how you behave is left up to you to decide.
Let me ask you a question. Have you ever met a Jew who believes in God, but who gossips, doesn't call his mother every day, will steal and cheat, lie about the age of their child to get a better fare on an air ticket? Do you know anybody who believes in God who does those things?
I might have met one or two of them.
Okay. Do you ever meet somebody who says, I don't believe in God? Gossip would never come out of their mouth. They're as caring about their parents as they can possibly be. It would be inconceivable then to lie about their child's age to get a better price on a ticket. And my argument is, the Jewish community looks at both of those people, and the Jewish community says, I don't care what you tell me your belief about God is. I'll look at how you behave. I'll tell you whether you believe in God or not.
I accept that, and I would certainly agree with that. But I don't believe that can be the end of the discussion, because I think once you remove God from this equation, you open yourself up to being able to say, I am acting as a good person by not making a person suffer more than is necessary, and I therefore can accept euthanasia. Or it can take all the way to its extreme. It can lead to Nazism and making your own decisions on who you feel should be in this world and who not, all for the good of mankind. So I do believe that ultimately our behavior has to have a God ingredient to it. Otherwise, it's left to our own devices. And our own devices are generally going to decide to do what is right for me.
I want to remind you, the Crusades were motivated by a belief in God. There are many in the Nazi regime who did it because of their view of Christianity. God does not protect you from what you hope it protects you from.
You are going to pick out the examples where religion,
No.
religion brought out the worst in people. So I'm going to counter with communism and Cambodia, and I'm going to show you and Nazism, and I'm going to show you where the absence of religion is. The bottom line is religion doesn't guarantee anything. It's what we make of the religion.
Right, and ultimately it comes back to your insight, that the Jewish tradition cares about how we behave.
No question about that.
You know, when I spoke before of having doubts, what I meant really was that there are times when we feel distant from God, at least I do. God is not some intellectual idea. God is hopefully at times a presence in our lives. And sometimes we feel that, and sometimes we don't. I think people have odd ideas about God. You know, people come to see me and they'll say, and they're eager to talk about God, which is wonderful, and they'll say, and they usually start the conversation, Rabbi, I don't believe in God. Right? And so we start to talk, and I say, tell me about the God that you don't believe in. And they begin to tell me about some injustice in the world, or something that happened to them when they were children, or some bad experience in synagogue. And at the end of they say what they say, and then I say, you know what? I don't believe in that God either, right? A belief in God is ultimately a statement of our own humility. It's a belief that there is something greater than us, and it's a belief that we are here for a reason. Yes, there are no guarantees, and yes, religious people do bad things. But the idea that I am secondary to something greater than me serves as a limit on my own hubris, and on my own sense of my ability to look, you know, we tend to get into trouble as people when we think that whatever we want and whatever we say is right. And we need to defer to something greater than ourselves.
I love that, by the way. I love both of you. Incidentally, in the end, summarize for me, for you, the overarching, powerful, positive message of the High Holidays.
Life is rich and good and beautiful, and it is a gift of God, and we shouldn't waste a moment of it. We should savor every bit of it.
Your ultimate...
That sounded good to me. Yeah, absolutely. And that what we are, where we are failing, we can change.
Andy, it is so kind of you to have taken time to sit with us and to share. I mean, you're everybody should understand. Andy Warmflash is going to be leading services in front of 2,000 people on the High Holidays, and yet he and Mitchell have taken the time to come to our studios and sit with me. It is an enormous kindness, and you're a very special human being, and I am envious of every one of the congregants who will sit in your services on the High Holidays and learn from your sweetness and your kindness and your wisdom. Kol tuva hatzlacha, and l'shana tova, only a happy and a healthy and a sweet new year.
A happy, healthy new year to both of you. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about Torah.
Thank you. And Mitchell Wohlberg has come up from Baltimore on a train to sit with me while he's getting ready to lead all of his congregants at Bet Filah Synagogue in Baltimore, Maryland. And for you to do this is an extraordinary kindness. You and I know each other. And again, you are one of the great teaching rabbis of our generation. And incidentally, I have here in my hand Pulpit Power. This is a treasure. This is unlike any other, quote, collection of sermons I've ever read. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
It's available through your synagogue, right?
That's correct.
The easiest way to get Mitchell Wohlberg's Pulpit Power is by going to the internet.
Beth Tefillah, BETHTFILOH.com.
Okay. Anyway, I want to thank you not only for the fact that you were willing to spend this time with me, and every time you speak, you thrill me, but also because you give me a chance to tell people about Pulpit Power, and it should be a #1 bestseller on the New York Times list.
Mark, I want to tell you, it was a thrill being here, but you attributed it to my kindness coming from Baltimore. I must be honest with you. I thought this was Oprah, but it worked out just as well.
Thank you,
A
thank
good
you.
year, a happy and
L'shana
healthy
tova
new year.
v'tuka. To both of you, thank you very,
you.
very, very much.
Good.
There you have it. You've heard two extraordinary human beings talk about the high holidays. I hope you'll be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you have to the things that Andrew Warmflash and Mitchell Wohlberg had to say on this program. And you can always write me either through email or by mail. And if you want to speak to Rabbi Warmflash or Rabbi Wohlberg, you can also do that through me. Any email you send them, I will forward if you send it to me. My friends, I also hope that every one of you who watch Shalom TV, who enjoy what we're doing, who've been so kind in sending me personally such lovely, lovely emails and letters, I hope every one of you, whether you're in the Jewish community or another community, you have a Shana Mituka, a sweet, lovely, wonderful year. You and your family, all your loved ones, a year of health, a year of prosperity, and a year in which you find fulfillment. May all your dreams be realized for good in the year to come. L'shana tova. Be well, my friends.